The day broke over the Wyoming territory like a slow bruise, the sky a deep, bruised purple that promised heat but no rain. In the town of Dust River, the light did not wash things clean. It only revealed the layers of grime. Dust, the color of old bone, coated every warped plank of the boardwalk, settled in the ruts of the main street, and clung to the stands of stubborn tumbleweed huddled against fence posts. The wind, a constant, nagging presence, carried the mingled scents of curing leather from the saddlery, the sharp tang of rusted metal from the half-built railroad spur that ended abruptly in the prairie, and the faint, ever-present smell of disappointment. Inside the Red Lark Inn, the air was thick with the ghosts of last night's whiskey and the morning's brewing coffee. Mara Quinn stood behind the long, scarred bar, a damp cloth in her hand. But she was not polishing the wood. Her movements were small and precise as she traced the rim of a clean glass, her gaze fixed on the heavy, leather-bound ledger that lay open before her. At 28, Mara's face had a stillness that some mistook for coldness. It was the calm of a ship's captain who has navigated too many storms to waste energy on flinching. Her eyes, a clear, bright gray, missed nothing. They were the eyes of a woman who knew that survival depended on accurate accounts. The ledger was her compass and her anchor. Each line of neat, dark ink was a step away from the debt that clung to her mother's small house, a debt that Sheriff Judd Kincaid had so kindly arranged to have transferred to her name after her husband's passing. Every coin dropped on the counter was measured, counted, and recorded. This book held the town's small tabs, but more importantly, it held Mara's memory and her quiet, unyielding claim to justice. A penny for a beer, a nickel for a shot, each one a tiny victory against the suffocating weight of what she owed. The dust of the street was an enemy. It crept under the door, hazed the windows, and tried to settle on the pages of her ledger. She hated it. Dust was a lie. It blurred edges, hid truths, and made everything look the same. Her numbers, however, were clean. They did not lie. Aunt Hester emerged from the back, a woman whose soft heart was barricaded behind a fortress of sharp opinions. She set a plate of biscuits on the bar with a thud. "You'll wear a hole in that book staring at it," she said, her voice a gravelly rasp. "The numbers will be the same tomorrow as they are today." Depressing. Mara dipped her pen in the inkwell. "They'll be a little better tomorrow," she replied. Not looking up, she made a small notation. Mr. Abernathy paid for his delivery. Hester snorted. "A miracle. Probably scared Kincaid would tax the air he breathes next. That man could squeeze blood from a stone and call it a civic duty." She leaned on the bar, her expression softening as she watched Mara. "You carry too much, girl." "It's the only way to get to the other side," Mara said softly. Her younger sister, Rosie, was the other side. Rosie, with her nose always buried in a book, dreaming of medical schools in the East, places with green lawns and clean lecture halls where dust was something you read about, not something you ate with every meal. That dream was expensive, and the ledger was the only map Mara had to get there. At that moment, the bat-wing doors swung open, letting in a rectangle of blinding morning light and a man who seemed to be carved from the unforgiving landscape itself. He was tall and lean, moving with a quiet economy that suggested he never wasted a step. A long, thin scar cut a pale line from his left temple down to his jaw, pulling at the corner of his mouth just enough to make a neutral expression look like a grim one. He wore practical, trail-worn clothes, and the dust on his boots was layered, telling a story of many miles traveled over different kinds of earth. He stopped just inside the door, his eyes methodically sweeping the room. They were a startlingly pale blue, the color of a winter sky, and they took in every detail: the number of men hunched over coffee, the position of the back door, the way Mara's hand rested near a heavy glass bottle. He was, Mara thought, a man who read the world like she read her ledger, looking for the bottom line. This was Eli Cutter. He had not come to Dust River for a drink. He had come looking for two things: a stolen bay gelding with a white blaze on its nose, and a younger brother named Jonah, who had disappeared into the westward churn of men seeking work on the railroad 2 years ago. At 32, Eli had spent most of his life as a frontier scout, a job that had taught him the language of silence and the truth of subtle signs. He had left that life behind, tired of the killing, but the skills remained. He could read the story of a bent blade of grass or a displaced stone. And he could read men. He approached the bar, his spurs making no sound on the wooden floor. He had tied them down. He did not like to announce himself. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low baritone, rough around the edges like a rope pulled over stone. "Coffee, if you have it." Mara nodded, turning to pour a cup from the pot on the small stove. She felt his eyes on her, not in the way most drifters or railroad men looked at her, with a coarse appraisal, but with a quiet, unnerving intensity. It was the look of a man cataloging details for later use. Eli took the cup, his gaze drifting to the ledger. He saw the precision of the script, the clean columns. It told him as much about the woman as the calm set of her jaw. She was organized. She was a fighter in her own way. He took a sip of the coffee. It was strong and bitter, just like the town. His search had led him here, to this dusty pocket of civilization clinging to the promise of the railroad. The trail of the horse thieves had gone cold a day's ride east, but he had found a dropped branding iron, one bearing the mark of the Union Pacific spur line. It was a small thing, but small things were all that mattered. People lied. The earth did not. His brother was a whisper, a ghost he chased through letters that had stopped coming and rumors from men who barely remembered a face. But Eli was patient. Patience and observation were the only tools he had ever truly trusted. Later that morning, the slow rhythm of the town was disturbed by the confident stride of Sheriff Judd Kincaid. He was a man in his 40s, with a soft middle that belied the hardness in his eyes. Unlike everyone else in Dust River, his uniform was impeccably clean, his badge polished to a high shine. Kincaid feared scandal more than sin, and he maintained the appearance of law and order with the same fastidious care he gave his mustache. He was a partner in Foreman Slade's railroad enterprises, a silent investor in the town's slow strangulation. He did not enter the Red Lark. Instead, he stopped at the blacksmith's forge across the street. From the window, Mara watched him speak to Simeon Pike. Sim was a mountain of a man, with arms thick from a lifetime of swinging a hammer. He was a gentle soul whose quiet dignity was a silent rebuke to the town's ingrained prejudices. He communicated more with the rhythmic, storytelling cadence of his hammer on steel than he ever did with words. Mara saw Sim shake his head slowly, his posture respectful but unyielding. Kincaid said something sharp, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, before turning and walking away. The sheriff did not like being told no, even quietly. The ranchers and farmers who trickled into town were a testament to silent endurance. Their faces were sun-scorched and wind-blasted, their hands calloused and cracked. They bought what they had to, spoke little, and watched everyone from under the brim of their hats. They were caught in the squeeze, paying Kincaid security fees and watching the railroad buy up water rights, their livelihoods drying up with the creeks. By afternoon, Rosie came into the inn, her face flushed with excitement. She held up a thick book. "It's Gray's Anatomy," she announced, her voice full of reverence. "The post rider brought it from Cheyenne. Can you believe it? It has pictures of everything." She opened it on the bar, careful to keep it away from a damp ring. Mara smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that briefly erased the weariness from her face. "Just be sure you know which parts go where before you start practicing on the customers." Rosie laughed. "I just want to learn, to understand how things work, to fix what's broken." She traced a diagram of the human heart. "I want to be a doctor. Mara, truly." "I know," Mara said, her voice soft. She looked from her sister's hopeful face to the unforgiving lines in her ledger. "And you will be?" A train whistle blew in the distance, a long, mournful sound that was both a promise of connection to the outside world and a threat of invasion. It was the sound of the future, a future that men like Kincaid and Slade were determined to own. Eli Cutter heard it too, standing by the livery. He watched a group of immigrant laborers, Irish and Chinese, head back toward the railroad camp, their faces grim with exhaustion. They were kept separate, paid less, and treated as expendable parts in the great iron machine. They, like the black man at the forge and the quiet woman in the saloon, were on the outside of the circle of power Kincaid had drawn around the town. He thought of his brother, Jonah, who might be among them. He had to be careful. In a town like Dust River, a man asking too many questions could find himself answering to the sheriff, and Eli had a feeling that Sheriff Kincaid was the kind of man whose answers were always final. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red, Eli found himself back at the Red Lark. The room was more crowded now, filled with the weary bodies and thirsty souls of men done with their day's labor. Mara moved behind the bar with an efficient grace, her face once again a calm, composed mask. He took a seat in the corner, nursing a beer, content to watch and to listen. He was waiting. He did not know for what, exactly, a word, a face, a sign. In his experience, if you watched a place long enough, it would eventually tell you its secrets. And Dust River, he was certain, was full of them. The dust that covered everything, he mused, was the perfect cover for all manner of sins. It hid the rust, the rot, and the truth. But eventually, the wind always shifts. The wind came first as a whisper, then a moan, rattling the windows of the Red Lark. By nightfall, it was a full-throated howl. A sandstorm had descended on Dust River, a roiling brown wall that erased the stars and turned the world outside into a churning chaos of grit and fury. Inside the inn, the lamps cast a warm, yellow glow, creating a small island of sanctuary against the storm. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, cheap whiskey, and the nervous energy of men who knew they were trapped for the night. Mara moved through the room, collecting empty glasses, her expression as serene as the eye of the hurricane raging outside. The storm did not frighten her. It was a known quantity, a force of nature you respected and waited out. The unpredictable tempers of men were far more dangerous. She exchanged a few quiet words with a rancher, refilled a coffee cup for another, and kept a steady, watchful eye on the room. Her ledger was put away for the night, its truths locked safely behind the bar. Eli Cutter sat at his corner table, nursing the same beer for the better part of an hour. He watched the storm through a small, clean patch on the window pane he had cleared with his sleeve. He was a man accustomed to solitude, but the forced intimacy of the storm-filled room was a different kind of test. He watched Mara, noting the way she moved, the way she could quiet a boisterous drunk with a single, level look. She did not command the room with noise or threats, but with a powerful, centered stillness. She was the anchor point around which the nervous energy of the room revolved. The bat-wing doors did not swing open so much as they were blasted inward by a gust of wind and the force of 3 men. Sheriff Judd Kincaid stood in the center, flanked by 2 of his thuggish deputies. They brought the storm inside with them. Dust swirled around their boots and settled on the floor in a fine, gritty film. The low murmur of conversation in the room died instantly, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. Kincaid's eyes, small and hard, scanned the room before settling on Mara. He smiled, a thin, unpleasant stretching of his lips that did not reach his eyes. "Evening. Mistress Quinn," he said, his voice carrying easily over the howl of the wind. "Nasty night. Good for business. I imagine all these souls in need of shelter." "Sheriff," Mara acknowledged, her hands resting flat on the polished wood of the bar. "What can I get for you?" "Oh, I'm not here for a drink," Kincaid said, strolling toward the bar, his deputies fanning out behind him, their presence a blunt threat. "I'm here on official town business. Collection. The town's security and prosperity fee. It seems we had a miscalculation in the last assessment. You're behind." Mara's spine stiffened, but her voice remained even. "I believe you'll find my account is paid in full. I have the receipt from last week." Kincaid chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "That was last week. This is this week. Things change. Costs go up. Foreman Slade is bringing progress to this town, and progress isn't cheap. The fee has been doubled, effective immediately." A few of the patrons shifted uncomfortably. This was not law. It was larceny with a badge. Doubled Mara's voice was still quiet, but now it had an edge of cold iron. "You can't be serious, Sheriff." "I am as serious as a locked jail cell," he retorted, his good humor vanishing. He slapped a hand on the bar. "Pay up, Mistress Quinn, or I will be forced to shut this establishment down for failure to contribute to the public good." Instead of reaching for the cash box, Mara retrieved her ledger and the tin box where she kept her receipts. She opened the book to the current page and slid it across the bar toward him. With deliberate care, she took out the most recent receipt and laid it beside the book. "There," she said, her finger pointing to the entry. "Paid, $10, the agreed-upon amount, and there is the proof." Kincaid glanced at the neat column of figures, his lip curling in a sneer. He saw her world laid out in perfect order, a silent accusation against his own chaotic greed. He snatched the small piece of paper, held it up between his thumb and forefinger, and with a theatrical flourish, ripped it into 4 neat squares. He let the pieces flutter to the floor. "It seems your proof has disappeared," he said. "Now, about that $20. Mara stared at the torn scraps of paper on the floor. It was more than paper. It was her work, her word, her small piece of meticulously maintained truth. He had not just torn a receipt. He had tried to tear a hole in her reality, to insist that what was real was whatever he said it was. Her jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in her cheek. One of Kincaid's deputies, a hulking man named Cale, grew impatient with the quiet standoff. He shoved a nearby prospector, a small, elderly man nursing a beer. "Get out of the way, old man," Cale grunted. The prospector stumbled, his bottle of beer slipping from his grasp and shattering on the floorboards. The sound of breaking glass was like a gunshot in the tense room. Before anyone else could react, Eli Cutter was on his feet. He did not look at Kincaid or his men. His pale blue eyes were fixed on Mara. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the charged atmosphere. "When you have a moment, I think that gentleman could use a glass of water. It seems his bottle is broken." The simplicity of the request was so unexpected it startled everyone. Kincaid, who had been puffing up for another tirade, paused, momentarily confused. Every eye in the room swung from the sheriff to the tall stranger in the corner. In that moment, Mara saw him, truly saw him. He was not looking at the guns on the deputy's hips. His gaze flickered down to their boots. She saw the minute shift in his eyes and understood. He was reading them. The dark, sticky mud clinging to Cale's heels, different from the dry dust of the town, told a story of a recent trip to the creek beds south of the railroad camp. He was gathering facts, not reacting to threats. He saw the world the way she did, as a series of details that, when properly assembled, revealed the truth. Eli saw her too. He saw the tremor in her hand as she rested it on the bar, a tremor she quickly stilled. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw that it was banked, controlled, like a fire kept low to conserve fuel. She was not a woman waiting for rescue. She was a captain holding the wheel steady in a gale, calculating her next move, refusing to be swamped by the wave that was breaking over her bow. Kincaid recovered, scowling at the interruption. "This doesn't concern you, stranger." He slammed a new, pre-written bill onto the bar. "Here's your new receipt. Mistress Quinn, just fill in the amount, $20. Eli's eyes dropped to the paper. His focus narrowed. In the top corner was a small, circular ink stamp, slightly blurred. It was an emblem of an eagle clutching a railroad spike, the official mark of the Union Pacific Project Office. His blood ran cold. It was the exact same mark he had seen pressed into a fragment of leather from his own saddle, found near the thieves' last cold campfire. The man extorting this woman and the men who had stolen his horse were connected. This was no longer just a spectacle. It was his fight now. "I will not pay for what I do not owe," Mara said, her voice low and unwavering. She pushed the false bill back toward Kincaid. The sheriff's face turned a mottled red. His pretense of civility shattered. In a swift, vicious movement, he leaned across the bar and his hand shot out, grabbing the front of Mara's simple work dress, twisting the fabric at her collar. "You'll pay what I tell you to pay, little lady, and you'll learn some respect." Before the gasp in the room had even subsided, Eli moved. He was not fast like a gunslinger, but with a fluid, predatory grace that was far more menacing. 2 long strides brought him to the bar. His hand, hard and unyielding as iron, closed around Kincaid's wrist. He did not squeeze hard. Not yet. He just held it. "Sheriff," Eli said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the room. "Take your hand off the lady." Kincaid's eyes bulged. He tried to pull his wrist free, but Eli's grip was immovable. Cale and the other deputy went for their guns, but Eli's pistol was already out, appearing in his left hand as if by magic. He did not point it at them. He held it low, angled toward the floor, but the message was unmistakable. The click of the hammer being thumbed back was deafeningly loud. "I wouldn't," Eli said, his pale eyes as cold and empty as a winter grave. Kincaid was a bully, not a fool. He knew the look of a man who had killed before and would not hesitate to do it again. A shootout in a crowded room was messy. It would raise questions. It would tarnish his reputation. He slowly, deliberately, released Mara's dress. Eli, in turn, released his wrist. The sheriff took a step back, breathing heavily, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. He straightened his coat and pointed a trembling finger at Mara. "Fine. Have it your way." He turned to the room. "This establishment is a threat to public order. The Red Lark is hereby closed for 3 days, pending an investigation." He pulled a sign from his coat pocket and tacked it brutally to the front door, the hammer blows echoing the suppressed violence of the last few minutes. He gave Eli one last look, a look that promised retribution, then turned and stalked out into the storm, his deputies trailing in his wake like chastened dogs. The tension in the room broke. Men let out breaths they had not realized they were holding. They began to leave, pulling on their coats, avoiding Mara's eyes, not wanting to be associated with her trouble. Within minutes, the Red Lark was empty, save for Mara, the broken glass on the floor, and the tall, quiet stranger who had just thrown a boulder into the stagnant pond of her life. Mara stood for a long moment, staring at the notice on her door. 3 days. 3 days of no income was a catastrophe. It put the next payment on her mother's house in jeopardy. She felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach, but she forced it down. She turned, her movement stiff, and began to pick up the larger pieces of the broken bottle. Eli watched her. He saw the strength it took for her not to crumble. Finally, she looked at him, her bright gray eyes shadowed with a weary sort of anger. She was not grateful. She was a realist. He had helped, but he had also marked her and himself. "You should not have done that," she said, her voice flat. "He put his hands on you," Eli replied simply. "Now he has a reason to come back. For both of us." She stood up, her hands full of broken glass. She walked to the trash bin and dropped the pieces in. The sound was sharp and final. She turned back to him. Her face set. "You cannot stay here." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, a warning born of a deep understanding of how this town worked. His presence was now a liability she could not afford. Eli looked at her, at the fierce, determined set of her chin, at the injustice of the sign nailed to her door. He had come to this town looking for a horse and a brother, a simple, straightforward mission. But the world was never that simple. He had seen her stand up to a tyrant with nothing but a book of numbers and her own integrity. It was the bravest thing he had seen in a long time. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. A wry, tired look entered his eyes. "Then stop giving me reasons to," he said quietly. The morning after the closing of the Red Lark dawned quiet and gray. The wind had died, leaving behind a world scoured clean and blanketed in a fresh layer of dust. The sign Kincaid had nailed to the door was a stark, ugly wound on the face of Mara's life. She stood in the small kitchen behind the inn, a cold cup of coffee in her hands, staring out the window at the silent street. 3 days felt like a lifetime. 3 days of watching her carefully balanced finances tip toward disaster. A soft knock came at the back door. It was Eli Cutter. He stood on the step, his hat in his hands, his expression unreadable. In the flat morning light, the scar on his face seemed less a mark of violence and more a part of the landscape of his skin, like a dry riverbed. "I figured you'd be up," he said. His voice was low, so as not to carry. Mara opened the door wider and stepped aside, letting him in. "There is not much point in sleeping," she replied, her voice devoid of emotion. She gestured to the empty kitchen table. "I cannot offer you much. The coffee is cold." "It's fine," he said, but he did not sit. He stood in the middle of her kitchen, a tall, unsettling presence who had somehow become entangled in her problems. What he did last night was not about money. It was about that. He nodded toward the front of the inn, where her ledger lay on the bar. "Your book. It tells a truth he wants to erase." "Truth does not pay the bills, Mr. Cutter, and it will not keep a roof over my sister's head." "No," he agreed, "but sometimes it's the only weapon you have." He paused, his pale blue eyes meeting hers. "That seal on his false bill, the railroad eagle, I've seen it before. Stamped into a piece of my own property, left behind by the men who stole my horse." Mara processed this, her sharp mind connecting the dots. The railroad. "You think Kincaid is working with them with Slade?" "I think Kincaid works for anyone who fills his pockets," Eli said. "I think your security fee is paying for more than the sheriff's polished boots. I need to find those men, not just for my horse anymore. And that mark is my only lead." A plan began to form in Mara's mind, a desperate and dangerous one. She looked from Eli's determined face to the closed door of the tavern. Her world was numbers, credits and debits, a careful accounting of reality. His was tracks in the dirt, physical evidence, the story the world told when you knew how to read it. Perhaps the two could be reconciled. "I need proof," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I need something concrete to take to the circuit judge when he comes through next month. Something more than my word against the sheriffs." He tore up my receipt. "He can claim I never paid." "And I need a trail," Eli said, understanding where she was going. An alliance, unspoken but clear, formed between them in the quiet kitchen, an uneasy partnership born of mutual desperation. "My ledger," Mara said, thinking aloud. "It shows the payments. Every week, like clockwork, a sudden doubling of the fee, with no town ordinance to support it. It shows a pattern." "A book is a start," Eli countered gently. "But a judge will want something he can hold, something they left behind. A piece of paper, a tool, anything that ties Kincaid's men to the railroad thieves." He looked at her directly. "You can provide the map of his greed. I can track the physical trail. We might find where they cross." The risk was enormous. If they were caught, Kincaid would not just close her in, he would find a way to take her house, to ruin her completely. She thought of Rosie, asleep in the next room, her anatomy book on the nightstand beside her. Was she entitled to gamble with her sister's future? But what was the alternative to let Kincaid bleed her dry? To be slowly crushed under the weight of his corruption until there was nothing left for Rosie anyway. "All right," she said, the single word feeling as heavy as a vow. "We have a deal." Later that day, they rode out of town, heading south toward the creek beds Eli had identified from the mud on the deputy's boots. The landscape was stark and unforgiving, the ground cracked and thirsty. At the edge of a dried-up stream, a ribbon of pale sand and smooth stones. Eli dismounted. Mara followed, her own movements less certain. He knelt, his long fingers hovering just above the ground. "Here," he said. He pointed to a series of overlapping impressions in the sand. To Mara, they were just hoof prints. To Eli, they were a page of a book. "There were 4 of them," he began, his voice taking on the quiet authority of a teacher. "This one is shod with a worn shoe. The nails are new. See the deep, sharp holes. He was replaced recently. The horse was carrying a heavy rider. The print is deep and even. He moved a few feet away. This one favors his left foreleg. The print is shallower. And this one," he pointed to a third set. "This is a shod horse, but it's trailing an unshod pony, probably a pack animal." He looked up at her, his eyes serious. "The ground tells the truth when people are silent. You just have to learn how to listen." Mara knelt beside him, trying to see what he saw. She was used to finding stories in numbers, but this was a different language entirely. Yet, as he pointed out the subtle details, the way a scuffed stone indicated a hurried pace, the way the pattern of prints showed the riders stopping to confer, she began to understand. It was just another kind of accounting. They followed the trail for over an hour, the sun beating down on their backs. The silence between them was comfortable, companionable. "You do not talk much, do you?" Mara observed, breaking the quiet. Eli glanced at her, a faint, surprising flicker of amusement in his eyes. He considered the question for a moment before answering, "I save my words for when they're needed." To her own surprise, Mara laughed. It was a small, rusty sound, as if the mechanism for it had not been used in a long time. Eli's mouth twitched at the corner, the closest he had come to a smile. In that shared moment, a fragile thread of trust was spun between them. When they returned to Dust River as evening fell, the town felt different. A notice had been posted on the public board, signed by Foreman Slade. It offered a handsome reward for information leading to the capture of the individual or individuals responsible for acts of sabotage and interference with the Union Pacific Railroad project. It was aimed directly at Eli, at them. Worse, one of Kincaid's deputies was going from business to business with a clipboard, collecting signatures on a petition of support for the sheriff's tireless efforts to maintain order. It was a loyalty oath. Mara watched from the window as the deputy stopped Simeon Pike outside his forge. She saw the blacksmith's powerful shoulders slump as he listened, saw him shake his head, and then saw the deputy say something, his hand drifting toward his sidearm. With a heavy heart, Sim took the pencil and signed his name. The screw was tightening. That night, Mara could not sleep. She sat at her kitchen table, the ledger open in the soft glow of a single lamp. Every line represented a choice, a small act of defiance. But now the cost was rising. She looked at the closed door to Rosie's room. Was she being brave, or just reckless? Was she fighting for justice, or was she pulling the roof down on the one person she had sworn to protect? The weight of the choice pressed down on her, a physical ache in her chest. Out on the prairie, Eli made a cold camp under the vast, star-filled sky. He lay in his bedroll, his hands behind his head, but his mind was far away. The sight of Kincaid grabbing Mara had stirred something in him, an old and unwelcome instinct. He hated the role of the hero. It was a liar's title. Years ago, on a scouting mission, he had faced an impossible choice: pursue a band of renegades who had attacked a settlement, or stay and help a small group of children who had become separated from their families in the chaos. A storm rolling in. His commander had ordered him to pursue. His gut had told him to protect the children. He had followed his gut. The children were saved. But in the delay, the renegades had doubled back and ambushed his comrades. Only he had survived. He carried their faces with him still. He had not been a hero that day. He had been a man who made a choice, and other men had paid the price. He would not make that mistake again. He was not here to save Dust River. He was here for a horse, and for his brother. Nothing more. The next day, the trail led them to an abandoned homestead, a skeleton of a house with a silent, rusted windmill groaning in the wind. The place felt desolate, haunted by a failed dream. In the center of the yard was a stone well, its opening a dark, gaping mouth. Eli dropped a rock into it. They waited. There was no splash, only the dry, hollow thud of stone hitting baked earth. The well was bone dry. It stood as a stark symbol of the town. Mara thought, a place of deep thirst, where the very source of life and justice had run dry. They pressed on, riding into the dusk. The pace was faster now, a sense of urgency pushing them forward. Eli spotted the faint glow of embers on a distant rise, and they approached with caution, tethering their horses and moving the last quarter-mile on foot. It was a recently abandoned campsite, the fire still warm. The men they were tracking were close. They searched the site carefully. There was not much. A few spent cartridges, an empty bean can, but then, tucked under a sagebrush, Mara's foot hit something hard. It was a small, metal lockbox. It was empty, its lid pried open and bent, but inside, clinging to the bottom, was a small, triangular scrap of paper, a piece of a receipt, its edges blackened and charred. Eli took the box, his touch gentle. He brought it to his nose and sniffed. "Pine tar," he said, his voice tight with discovery. He held it out to Mara. The smell was sharp and distinctive, the same smell that clung to the new railroad ties stacked by the warehouse at the edge of town. He looked at the singed piece of paper in his hand. Then he looked at Mara, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. "I think we've found where the trails cross." The plan was thin, woven from desperation and pine tar. The railroad warehouse was a hive of activity during the day, a constant clamor of hammers, shouting men, and the groan of heavy timber. Blending in would be their only camouflage, dressed in durable work clothes, her hair tucked up under a dusty cap. Mara looked less like a tavern keeper and more like a young man seeking a day's wage. Eli, his own appearance already that of a man who worked with his hands, needed little disguise. The most dangerous part of the plan fell to Rosie, while Mara and Eli would join a crew loading newly tarred railroad ties. Rosie, armed with a delivery manifest for the foreman's office, would slip inside the administrative building. Her youth and unassuming nature were her shield. No one would suspect a girl with a bookish face of anything more than a simple errand. Her task was to find the originals, the source documents from which Kincaid's torn receipt had been copied. They approached the yard separately. The air was thick with the sharp, medicinal scent of the pine tar, a smell that now made Mara's stomach clench. Eli found a crew boss and spoke to him in low tones, pointing to Mara and himself, offering 2 strong backs for a few hours' pay. The boss, overworked and short-handed, grunted an affirmative and waved them toward a flat car piled high with heavy, tar-coated ties. The work was brutal. The ties were heavy, slick, and left black, sticky residue on their hands and clothes. Mara's muscles screamed in protest, but she set her jaw and mirrored Eli's steady, rhythmic movements. She focused on the weight, the strain, the splintered wood, using the physical pain to crowd out her fear. From her position on the flat car, she could see the small office building. She watched as Rosie, a small, determined figure, walked up the steps and disappeared inside. Every minute that passed after that was an exercise in controlled panic. Inside the office, Rosie's heart hammered against her ribs. The room smelled of paper, stale cigar smoke, and ink. A harried-looking clerk barely glanced at her as she placed the manifest on his desk and explained she was told to wait for a signature. He waved her toward a bench along the wall. The office was lined with shelves, each one overflowing with ledgers, binders, and stacks of loose paper. It was an archive of Slade's entire operation. Rosie waited, her eyes scanning the shelves, her mind racing. The clerk was distracted by a wagon driver arguing about a lost shipment. Seizing the moment, Rosie stood and walked quietly toward the shelves, pretending to look for a specific file. Her eyes darted over the handwritten labels. Invoices, payroll, shipping, Then she saw it. On a lower shelf, a row of smaller, identical books bound in dark green leather. One was labeled Town Accounts. J.K. Her breath caught. J.K. Judd Kincaid. Her hands trembling. She pulled the small ledger from the shelf. It was heavier than it looked. She slipped back to the bench just as the clerk finished his argument. He scribbled a signature on her manifest without looking at it and shoved it back at her. There. Now get... Clutching the ledger under her arm, hidden by her shawl, Rosie walked out of the office, her legs feeling like water. She did not run. She walked, step by careful step, back toward the main gate. At the flat car, the work continued. A new man was overseeing their crew, a younger man with a confident swagger and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He barked an order, and Eli, heaving a tie onto his shoulder, turned. He froze. The young man stared back, his own expression of authority dissolving into a mask of disbelief and then a cold, hard anger. The years had changed him, filled out his frame and etched lines of hard living around his mouth. But there was no mistaking him. It was Jonah. Eli. The name was a choked whisper, then a bitter accusation. "What in God's name are you doing here?" Eli slowly lowered the railroad tie to the ground. The noise of the yard faded away to a dull roar in his ears. "Jonah, I've been looking for you." "Looking for me?" Jonah laughed. A sharp, humorless sound. "You have a funny way of showing it. A letter once a year. Then nothing. I suppose you finally ran out of wars to fight and came looking for a handout." He looked Eli up and down, taking in his worn clothes, the scar. "Still living by the gun. I see. Or have you been reduced to hauling timber for a living?" The words were like stones, each one a well-aimed blow. Eli stood silent, his face a granite mask. The long, complicated story of what had happened, of the ambush, of the guilt he carried, was too heavy to be spoken in a noisy rail yard. Any explanation would sound like a coward's excuse. He could not find the words. "I heard you were working the railroad," Eli said, his voice rough. "I am not just working it. I help run it," Jonah said with a proud lift of his chin. He was one of Slade's most trusted assistants. "I made something of myself. No thanks to you. You left us, Eli. You left me and Ma to fend for ourselves while you went off to play soldier." "It was not like that." Eli started, but Jonah cut him off. "Save it," he gestured to Mara. "And who is this another stray you picked up along the way?" His eyes narrowed. "Wait, I recognize you. You are the woman from the saloon, the one causing trouble for Sheriff Kincaid." His gaze snapped back to Eli. "So that is it. You are with them. The saboteurs Slade warned us about." Before Eli could answer, a shout came from the direction of the office. The clerk stood on the steps, his face red, pointing. There, the girl. She stole a ledger. Everything happened at once. Men turned, their faces hostile. Jonah's expression hardened from anger to duty. "Seize them!" he yelled. Eli grabbed Mara's arm. "Time to go." They scrambled down from the flat car, breaking into a run. They dodged wagons and stacks of equipment, the shouts of their pursuers rising behind them. They saw Rosie ahead, running toward them, the green ledger clutched to her chest like a prayer book. "This way," Eli yelled, changing direction, leading them toward a siding where a line of disused freight cars sat rusting on the tracks. He half lifted, half threw Rosie onto the deck of an old flat car, then helped Mara up before vaulting aboard himself. "The brake," he shouted, pointing to a large, rusted iron wheel at the front of the car. The siding was on a slight downward grade. If they could get it moving, they might have a chance. Mara and Eli threw their combined weight against the wheel. It groaned, resisted. Then with a screech of tortured metal, it began to turn. The flat car shuddered and then slowly, ponderously, began to roll. It picked up speed, moving down the gentle slope, away from the main yard. Men ran alongside for a few yards, then fell back, shaking their fists. Jonah stood watching them go. his face a mixture of fury and a flicker of something else, something lost and confused. They were not safe yet. The track led out into the open prairie, where they would be easily followed. But then the sky, which had been a clear, hard blue all day, began to change. The horizon turned a sickly yellow. The wind picked up, carrying a fine, stinging grit. A sandstorm, the second in 3 days, was bearing down on them. It hit with the force of a physical blow, a sudden, blinding wall of sand and wind that reduced visibility to a few feet. The storm that had trapped them now saved them, erasing their tracks, hiding them in its howling, chaotic heart. Eli managed to slow the flat car to a halt, the wheels grinding in the sand that was already piling up on the tracks. "Off!" he yelled over the wind. "We need shelter." He led them away from the tracks, into a cluster of large rock formations that offered a meager break from the wind. They found a shallow overhang, a crevice in the stone just large enough for the 3 of them to huddle together. The wind shrieked around them, and the world beyond their small sanctuary was a brown, churning void. In the relative quiet of the hollow, they caught their breath. Rosie, pale but resolute, held out the ledger to Mara. "I got it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Mara took the book, her hands black with tar, and hugged her sister tightly. "You were so brave." Eli leaned against the rock wall, his arm held tight against his side. A long, shallow gash ran along his forearm, a gift from a splintered railroad tie. Blood seeped through his torn sleeve. "You are hurt," Mara said, her voice sharp with concern. She immediately tore a strip of cloth from the hem of her petticoat. She gently took his arm and began to clean the wound with water from their canteen. Her touch was firm and steady. They sat in silence for a few moments, the only sound the muffled roar of the wind. Being this close to him, feeling the warmth of his skin, the solid reality of him, was both unsettling and deeply comforting. "I am sorry about your brother," Mara said softly. Eli did not look at her. He stared out into the blinding sand. "Some things, once they're broken, do not get fixed." "He is your family," Mara insisted gently. "Family is not just about blood," Eli said, his voice low and hard. "It is about who stands with you when the wind blows." His eyes flickered to Rosie, huddled beside Mara. "You know that." Mara finished wrapping his arm, her fingers lingering for a moment on the knot. She thought about the risks she was taking, the danger she had pulled her sister into. "I am afraid," she confessed, her voice so quiet he had to lean closer to hear. "I am afraid of what she will think of me, that she will see me not as someone who fought for what was right, but as someone who gambled away her future. I am afraid of becoming someone my sister would be ashamed of." Eli finally turned to look at her. The hardness in his expression softened. "From what I've seen," he said, his voice losing its rough edge, "you are giving her a lesson no school in the East could ever teach her." A small, wry smile touched Mara's lips. She looked out at the storm. "You seem to know your way around the wind." "You learn to read it," he said. "Which way it's blowing, how fast it's coming. You learn to guess what it will do next." Mara's smile widened slightly. "I imagine guessing the anger of a man is a good deal harder." The remark hung in the air between them, a moment of shared, bitter humor in the heart of the storm. Miles away, the sandstorm forced the pursuit to a halt. Jonah stood by his horse, his back to the wind, his mind a turmoil of conflicting emotions. The image of Eli, older, scarred, but still his brother, was burned into his thoughts. He had spent years nursing a grievance, building a story of abandonment that had become the foundation of his new life. Seeing Eli had shaken that foundation. He had wanted his brother to be a villain, a ghost from a past he had escaped. But the man he had seen was just a man trying to survive, just like him. As the first gusts of the storm had hit, Jonah had seen something else. A small group of homesteaders, their wagon caught in the open, were struggling to secure a loose water barrel. Before the sand had completely obscured his vision, he had seen a figure run from the back of the Red Lark, not away from the storm, but toward the family. It was the woman, Mara. She was helping them, giving them shelter in her shuttered inn, her face a picture of calm, determined compassion. It was a small act, easily missed, but for Jonah, it was a profound contradiction. Saboteurs did not stop to help strangers in a storm. They did not give away water for free. The seed of doubt, planted by his brother's unexpected appearance, began to crack open. The storm had passed, but it had left the world gasping for breath. The sun beat down with a renewed vengeance, baking the damp earth into a cracked, gray shell. Dust River was dying of thirst. The creek, which had always been the town's lifeblood, had dwindled to a muddy trickle. Foreman Slade, in his infinite wisdom, had ordered a crude earthen dam built upstream, diverting what little water remained to his railroad camp for mixing concrete and feeding the steam engine. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The small farms and ranches that dotted the prairie began to wither. Corn stalks, once green with promise, turned a sickly yellow and drooped in the fields. Cattle stood listlessly by empty water troughs, their ribs showing like the hoops on a barrel. In town, the public well ran dry. A quiet, desperate anger began to simmer just beneath the surface of the town's weary resignation. People muttered curses at Slade and Kincaid, but they did so in whispers, afraid to draw the attention of the men who controlled both the law and the water. Mara saw the desperation in the faces of the women who came into town, their shoulders slumped with the weight of empty buckets. She saw it in the eyes of the farmers who could only afford to buy a single drink when they used to buy a round. The Red Lark was still officially closed, but Mara could not stand by and do nothing. Her fight with Kincaid had started with a ledger. It would continue with one. Working at her kitchen table, she drew a new set of columns in a fresh section of her book. At the top of the page, she wrote in her neat, clear script, "The Water Fund." She took what little money she had saved and used it to buy 2 large barrels of water from a freight hauler passing through from a town further up the river, where the creek still ran full. She placed the barrels by her back door, with a dipper hanging from a hook. The word spread quietly. A rancher's wife would come by, her face etched with worry, and Mara would give her a bucket of water. She would ask for nothing in return, but would simply open her ledger. "I have marked you down for 1 bucket. Received," she would say calmly. "If you can spare anything later, a few eggs, a patch of mending, we will mark it down as paid." Some paid with a few cents, others brought a loaf of bread. A few, with nothing to give, simply nodded, their eyes full of a gratitude that was more valuable than coin. Mara recorded everything: who received, who contributed. The ledger was open on the table for anyone to see. It was not charity. It was a community account book. It was an act of transparent solidarity, a quiet, orderly rebellion against the forced drought. Eli watched her, a silent observer. He spent his days scouting the area around the railroad camp, looking for any sign of his horse or the men who had taken it, but he always returned to the small house behind the shuttered inn. He saw the strength in what Mara was doing. She was not fighting Slade's dam with dynamite. She was fighting it with dignity. He took his horse to Simeon Pike's forge. The big blacksmith worked with a focused intensity, his hammer striking the hot iron in a steady, rhythmic cadence. He pulled the old shoes, trimmed the hooves, and began to shape the new ones, the forge fire casting dancing shadows on his sweat-slicked arms. "That is a good horse," Sim said, his voice a low rumble. He ran a hand down the gelding's leg, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. "He has seen some miles." "He has," Eli agreed. Sim fitted the hot shoe to the hoof. The smell of burning keratin filled the air. "Heard you stood up to Kincaid," the blacksmith said, not looking up from his work. "I was just sitting down for a drink," Eli replied non-committally. Sim grunted, a sound of skeptical amusement. He hammered the nails in with quick, precise blows. Folks in this town have forgotten how to stand. They have been bent over for so long, they are starting to think it is the natural shape of a man's back. He finished the last nail and straightened up, running a critical eye over his work. There, that will hold. He looked at Eli, his dark eyes serious. You know, a good nail does not seem like much, but without it, the wheel comes off, and the whole wagon of justice sits stuck in the mud. The words, simple and profound, settled in Eli's mind. He was just one man, one nail, but perhaps he could help keep the wheel turning. His new resolve was tested sooner than he could have imagined. That afternoon, as Mara was explaining the water ledger to a young homesteader, Kincaid and his deputies appeared at her back gate. They were not there for a negotiation. "Rosalind Quinn," Kincaid said, his voice flat and official. Rosie, who had been reading on the back steps, looked up, her eyes wide with alarm. "You are under arrest for the theft of private property from the Union Pacific Railroad Company." Mara froze, the dipper slipping from her hand and clattering on the stones. "What are you talking about? She is a child. She has done nothing." "We have a sworn statement from the company clerk," Kincaid said, a smug look on his face. "Says she walked right out of the office with the company ledger. We found it in her room." Mara's blood ran cold. They must have searched the house while she was at the well. She had hidden the green ledger, but not well enough. One of the deputies took Rosie's arm. The girl cried out, a small, frightened sound. No, Mara moved forward, but the other deputy blocked her path. "Do not interfere. Mistress Quinn," Kincaid warned. "Unless you want to join her." He looked from Mara's terrified face to the back door, where Eli had appeared, his expression a thundercloud. Kincaid smiled. "I am a reasonable man. However, I am willing to discuss terms." They took Rosie to the small stone jailhouse next to the sheriff's office. A few minutes later, Kincaid came to the Red Lark. He did not bother to knock. "Here is the deal," he said, standing in the middle of her kitchen. "You want the girl back? You give me the stolen property. And you give me that little book of yours, the one you keep all your precious numbers in. Then you sign a statement saying this has all been a misunderstanding. You withdraw your complaint to the circuit judge. You do that, and the girl goes free." He wanted to erase her. He wanted to take not just the evidence, but the record of the crime itself. He wanted her silence, her complicity, her complete and total surrender. After he left, Mara sank into a chair, her body trembling. The strength that had sustained her, the cold, clear anger, was gone, replaced by a raw, suffocating fear. Eli stood by the window, his back to her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I will go," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I will turn myself in. I will tell him I was the one who took the book. I will take her place." Mara looked up, her eyes blurry with unshed tears. She saw the guilt in his rigid posture, the self-destructive impulse of a man trying to atone for an old sin. And in that moment, her own fear was burned away by a fierce, protective clarity. She stood up and walked to him, placing a hand on his arm. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You will not. We do not trade people." Eli, trading one person to a thief only teaches him the price of a life. It does not make him stop being a thief. It just makes him a kidnapper. He turned to face her, his pale eyes full of a tormented conflict. "Then what do? We cannot just leave her in there." "No," Mara agreed, her mind already working, calculating, planning. "We do not leave her. We take her back." The plan they devised was as desperate as their situation. The town's only fire bell was in the small, rickety steeple of the church, directly across the square from the jail. The jail itself was a simple stone building with 2 cells and a small office, but it had been built around an older structure, a small kitchen that had been part of the original trading post. The kitchen's old cooking hearth and chimney were still intact, though they had been sealed up from the inside. At dusk, a water wagon, the same one Mara had been using for her fund, rumbled into the town square. Eli at the reins, He made a show of having trouble with one of the wheels, stopping directly in front of the sheriff's office. At the same moment, on the other side of town, a terrible clamor erupted from Sim's forge, a great, rhythmic, metallic banging, as if the blacksmith were trying to hammer a locomotive into submission, echoed through the streets. Kincaid and one of his deputies came out of the office, drawn by the twin distractions. While they were yelling at Sim to stop his racket and trying to figure out what was wrong with the wagon, Eli slipped away, melting into the deep shadows behind the jail. He scaled a low wall, found the base of the old chimney, and began to climb. He moved up the rough stone like a spider, his fingers and toes finding purchase in the crumbling mortar. He pulled himself over the top and looked down into the black, narrow shaft. It was a tight fit, and the air was stale and thick with the smell of old soot. He lowered himself in, his back and shoulders scraping against the rough brick. Meanwhile, Mara had gone to the church. She slipped inside the small, empty building and climbed the ladder to the bell tower. The bell was old, and a dark, jagged line ran through its bronze flank, a crack that had been there as long as anyone could remember. She took hold of the thick, frayed rope. Eli dropped the last few feet into the old fireplace. Landing in a cloud of dust and soot, he was in a small, dark storage room. He forced the flimsy interior door and found himself in the short hallway that connected the two cells. Rosie was in the first one, her face pale in the dim light filtering through the barred window. "Eli," she whispered, a mixture of terror and relief. He put a finger to his lips and examined the lock. It was a simple, heavy thing. He pulled a thin piece of steel from his boot, a tool he had fashioned for just such a purpose, and went to work. At that moment, the church bell began to ring, but it was not a clear, sharp alarm. The crack in the bell gave it a strange, discordant voice. It was a jarring, off-key clang, a broken sound that spoke of a distorted, damaged justice. The sound sent Kincaid and his men running toward the church. Thinking it was a fire, it was the opening Eli needed. The lock clicked open. He swung the cell door wide and pulled Rosie out. They slipped out the back of the jail just as the first of Kincaid's men realized they had been tricked. They fled through the back alleys of the town, heading for the darkness of the prairie. But they were seen. A shout went up, followed by the bright flash and deafening roar of a gunshot. They made it to the edge of town and did not look back, but they did not need to. A strange, orange glow began to rise against the night sky. It grew brighter, fiercer, painting the undersides of the clouds in hellish colors. Mara, running beside Eli, her arm around her sister, finally dared to glance over her shoulder. The red lark was on fire. Great tongues of flame licked at the night sky, consuming her home, her livelihood, her past and her future. Everything. The water fund, the ledger, the small house her mother had left her. All of it was turning to ash and smoke. They stopped, miles out, on a small, windswept hill, and watched it burn. The fire was a beacon of Kincaid's rage, a message to the whole town. This is what happens when you defy me. Mara stood shivering. Though the night was not cold, the heat from the fire seemed to reach them even here. She had won. She had gotten her sister back, but she had lost everything else. The cost had been absolute. Eli stood beside her, his face grim, illuminated by the distant flames. He had been a part of this. His presence, his fight, had brought this destruction down upon her. Mara turned to him, her face a pale, ghostly mask in the firelight. The fight was gone from her eyes, replaced by a hollow, empty despair. "Go," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Get out of here. He will hunt you down. You have to go, now." Eli looked at her, at the utter devastation in her eyes. He saw a strength that had been pushed beyond its limit, a courage that had finally been broken on the anvil of a cruel reality. He did not say a word. He simply closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. It was not a gentle embrace. It was a desperate, clinging thing, his arms wrapping around her as if he could physically hold her together. as if his own solid presence could shield her from the ruin that glowed on the horizon. Mara collapsed against him, her body finally surrendering to the tremors she had been fighting, her face buried in the rough fabric of his shirt. He held on, a silent, solitary anchor in a world that had just burned down around them. The skeleton of the abandoned homestead offered little comfort against the vast, indifferent darkness of the prairie. Wind moaned through the gaps in the plank walls, a lonely, keening sound that seemed to mourn the failed dreams the old house represented. In the lee of a crumbling stone chimney, a small fire crackled, a tiny bubble of warmth and light in the immense, cold night. It pushed back the darkness just enough to illuminate 3 figures huddled together. Rosie was asleep, curled up in a bedroll a few feet away, her face peaceful in the flickering light. The stolen ledger tucked beside her like a child's doll. Mara and Eli sat closer to the flames, sharing his heavy wool coat. The garment was old, the fabric worn thin in places and patched with different colored thread, a testament to a long and hard life. The heat of the fire was on their faces, but the cold of the night seeped in from behind, forcing them to sit close, their shoulders touching. Mara stared into the dancing flames, but she did not see them. She saw the red lark, its roof collapsing inward, its walls turning to black, skeletal fingers reaching for the night sky. The shock had worn off, leaving behind an ache so deep it felt as if a part of her own body had been burned away. Everything she had worked for, every carefully recorded penny, every drop of sweat, had been consumed in that fire. She had won the battle for Rosie, but Kincaid had won the war for her life. It was all gone. She shivered, a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. She looked at Eli. The firelight carved deep shadows on his face, accentuating the stark line of his scar. He was a rock in the churning sea of her despair, solid and unwavering, and he was going to die because of her. Kincaid and Slade would not stop now. They would hunt him down, not just for the ledger, but for the humiliation he had dealt them. The bounty on his head was no longer a threat. It was a death sentence. The thought was a shard of ice in her heart. Her own ruin was one thing. His death would be another. It was a weight she could not bear. She turned to him, her voice a dry, cracking whisper. Her eyes, which had been so bright and clear, were now clouded with a film of unshed tears, reflecting the fire like shattered glass. "You cannot stay here," she said. It was not an accusation or a dismissal. It was a plea, a desperate attempt to push him to safety, to sever the cord that tied his fate to her own doomed one. Eli looked at her, his pale eyes searching her face. He heard the words, but he also heard the heartbreaking music underneath them. He saw her trying to be strong, trying to manage this one last thing, to save him from the wreckage. He saw her love for him, a fierce, protective thing disguised as a command to leave. He did not argue. He did not offer reassurances. He simply answered her truth with his own. His voice was low, rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. He reached for her, his hand closing gently but firmly on her arm, and he pulled her toward him, turning her to face him fully. The coat fell away from her shoulders. "Then stop giving me reasons to," he shot back, the words a low volley, not of anger, but of raw, undeniable fact. He pulled her into his arms, a motion that was both a capture and a surrender. The embrace was not soft. It was the desperate collision of 2 solitary souls who had found an unexpected harbor in one another. Mara gasped, a small, choked sound, as her face pressed against the rough fabric of his shirt. For a moment, she resisted, her hands pushing weakly against his chest. Then, with a shuddering sigh, she gave in. The fight went out of her. Her arm slid around his waist, her hands gripping the back of his coat as if she were drowning. She felt the solid, steady beat of his heart against her cheek. She was not alone. In the heart of her ruin, she was not alone. They held each other for a long time, saying nothing, the wind and the fire, the only other voices in the night. Finally, they drew apart, though their hands remained linked, a warm current passing between them. The air was charged, thick with all the things they had never said. Mara looked down at their joined hands, her face flushed in the firelight. She felt flustered, her carefully constructed composure shattered. She sought refuge in observation, her mind trying to catalog the stunning force of what had just happened. "You say so little," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "But every word you speak is large." A faint, wry smile touched Eli's lips. It was a sad, tired smile, but it was genuine. "I save my words," he said, his voice quiet, "for when they are needed." His answer, so simple and so true to the man he was, settled her. It made her feel safe. She had been seen and understood. His vulnerability invited her own. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw past the scout, past the fighter. She saw a man carrying a heavy burden. "Why are you doing this? Eli risking so much for me." "For Rosie." He was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, as if he were reading a report from a long-forgotten campaign. "Years ago, I was scouting for the army. We were tracking a raiding party. My orders were clear: pursue and engage. Do not deviate." He paused, the memory playing out behind his eyes. "We came across a small group of children from the settlement they had hit. They were lost, hiding in a ravine. A blue norther was blowing in, the kind of storm that can freeze a man solid in an hour." He turned his hand over, his thumb stroking the back of hers. "The lieutenant said to leave them, that the mission came first." I looked at their faces. I thought of my own brother, Jonah, who was about their age then. I made a choice. I disobeyed the order. I got the children to a safe place, a hunter's line cabin I knew of. It took a few hours. His voice dropped lower. The words scraped raw with old pain. "When I got back to my unit, it was too late. The raiders had circled back. They had set an ambush. I was the only one who rode out of that canyon." He looked at her then, his pale eyes bleak. "They call it survivor's guilt in the books Rosie reads. I suppose it is just a name for being haunted. I have spent a long time trying not to be anyone's hero. Mara, because I know the cost. I know what happens when I choose wrong." The confession hung in the air between them, stark and painful. Mara finally understood the source of his solitary nature, his reluctance to get involved. He was not cold. He was wounded. She tightened her grip on his hand, a silent acknowledgement of his burden, and she felt compelled to share her own. "My husband, Thomas," she began, her voice soft. "He did not die in some grand Western fashion. There was no gunfight, no stampede. He died of a fever, sweating and shivering in the same bed I slept in for 3 years after. He was a good, quiet man. He borrowed money from Kincaid's predecessor to build the extension on the inn. The debt was fair, but after Thomas died, Kincaid took over his accounts. Suddenly, the numbers changed. Interest was added. Fees appeared. The debt doubled. It was a lie written in ink." She looked at the fire, her expression hardening with the memory of that quiet, suffocating injustice. "That is why the ledger matters so much to me. It is not just about the money. It is about the truth. It is the only thing I have that is clean, in a town covered in dust and lies. My numbers do not lie. My husband died, and a thief tried to steal his memory. I would not let him." They sat in silence, their confessions laid bare between them like offerings. They had seen the deepest, most painful truths of each other, the wounds that had shaped them. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, and the night had grown colder. The reality of their situation remained. They were fugitives, with nothing but a stolen ledger and the clothes on their backs. "What will we do in the morning?" Mara whispered, the question a fragile thread of hope in the vast darkness. Eli did not offer a grand plan. He did not make a promise of a safe and easy future. He simply turned to her, his face serious in the dying light of the embers, and made the only promise that mattered. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I will still be here." It was enough. It was everything. As they settled in for the few remaining hours of the night, huddled together under the patched army coat, Eli looked at Mara's hands, resting on her lap. They were not the soft hands of a lady. The nails were short, one of them broken. The palms were calloused from work, from hauling water, from fighting for her life. He thought of her standing behind her bar, her spine straight, her gaze clear, a woman of substance and quiet courage. He reached out and gently touched her fingers. "One day," he said, his voice a low murmur, almost a vow, "you will not have to count every single penny just to be respected." Her eyes fluttered closed, and, for the first time since the fire, a single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the soot and grime on her cheek. The weight of what he had witnessed sat like a stone in Jonah's gut. He had found his place in the world, or so he had thought, on the right hand of Foreman Slade, a man who was carving the future out of the wilderness with iron and sweat. Slade spoke of order, progress, and the taming of a wild land, but in the dim, foul-smelling confines of the Dust River jail. Jonah saw what that order was built on. He saw Sheriff Kincaid, his face contorted in a mask of petty rage, beating a homesteader who had been arrested for vagrancy, a man whose only crime was that his well had run dry and he could not pay the security fee. Kincaid was not enforcing the law. He was collecting a debt with his fists. The sound of the blows, the soft, sickening thuds, turned Jonah's stomach. This was not progress. This was brute force, the same lawless violence he thought he had left behind. His loyalty, once so clear and sharp, had fractured. He sought out Eli, finding him at the edge of town, mending a piece of tack near the abandoned homestead. The meeting was stiff, the air between them thick with years of unspoken resentment. "They burned her place down," Jonah said, the words coming out clipped and harsh. It was not the greeting he had intended. Eli did not look up from his work, his hands moving with slow, deliberate precision. "I know. Slade says you are a saboteur, a criminal." "And what do you say?" Eli's voice was quiet, devoid of accusation. Jonah's anger, his long-nurtured grievance, rose up in him. "I say you abandoned us. I say you left and never looked back, and now you ride in here like some righteous avenger, telling everyone else how to live." Eli finally stopped his work. He slowly wiped his hands on a rag and looked at his younger brother. The weariness in his eyes was profound, the look of a man who had been fighting a war on too many fronts for too long. He did not offer explanations or excuses for the past. He knew they would sound hollow. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, worn leather wallet, its silver corners tarnished with age and use. He held it out to Jonah. "This was Ma's," Eli said, his voice level. "She gave it to me the day I signed on with the Scouts, told me to keep a little piece of home with me." He pushed it into Jonah's hand. "I have carried it every day since she died. I came through this territory 2 years ago asking after you, and last year, and the year before that, I followed a rumor of a rail crew job to Cheyenne, and a story about a card game to Laramie. I was always looking for you. Jonah, I just was not good at finding you." Jonah stared at the wallet in his palm. It was light, but it felt as heavy as a blacksmith's anvil. He opened it. Tucked inside was not money, but a faded tintype photograph of 3 boys, squinting in the sun, their arms slung around each other's shoulders. Himself, Eli, and their older brother, lost to a fever years ago. The wallet was proof, not of innocence or justification, but of a constant, quiet search. The anger that had been his shield for so long began to crumble, leaving him feeling exposed and raw. The crack in his certainty widened into a chasm. While the brothers wrestled with their broken past, Mara was building a new future, one piece of paper at a time. The burning of the Red Lark had not destroyed her. It had refined her. It had burned away everything but the core of her purpose. With the help of Simeon Pike, a now openly defiant Rosie, and the town's elderly, stoop-shouldered pastor, she began her counterattack. They procured the largest sheet of shipping paper they could find and, using Sim's Forge as their workshop, created a document with Rosie's neat hand. They drew up a large, public version of the Waterfund ledger, but this one was different. It was a public accounting of Kincaid's extortion, in bold, clear columns. It listed the name of every business and homesteader, the date of each security fee payment, and the amount paid. The final column was titled, Amount Overcharged. The next morning, in the full light of day, this small group of rebels marched into the town square. Sim, carrying a hammer and a handful of nails, strode to the public notice board. With 4 loud, deliberate blows, he nailed the paper up for all to see. It was a declaration of war fought with ink and paper. The townspeople gathered slowly, hesitantly. They saw their own names, their neighbors' names. They saw the numbers, the undeniable, cumulative proof of the theft they had all endured in silence. A murmur went through the crowd, a sound of shared grievance finally given a voice. The victory was short-lived. Foreman Slade, alerted to the public defiance, rode into the square with a half-dozen of his men, Jonah trailing reluctantly behind them. Slade's face was a thundercloud. He saw the sign, saw the crowd, and his eyes narrowed with fury. "This is an illegal assembly," he roared. "And that," he pointed a thick finger at the notice, "is slander against a public official. Disperse now." The crowd wavered, but no one moved. Emboldened by the public truth, they held their ground. Slade's face darkened. He drew his pistol and fired a single shot into the air. The crack of the gun was like a whip. The crowd broke, scattering in a wave of panic, fear. It turned out, was still a more powerful currency than truth. The square was empty in seconds, leaving Mara, Sim, and the others standing alone before their public ledger. The land itself seemed to conspire against them. The drought had reached its peak. The earth was a parched, cracked canvas of brown and gray. The air was hot and still, so dry that a spark could ignite the entire prairie. On the horizon, dark, bruised-looking clouds gathered, but they brought no rain. Instead, they flickered with an internal, angry light. Dry lightning, the threat of a wildfire, a ravenous, unstoppable blaze, now hung over them all. Their time was running out. Their only hope was the circuit judge, who was due to arrive for the quarterly market day in 2 days' time. Their new plan was simple and desperate. They had to get the Green Railroad ledger, the public notice, and their star witness, Jonah, to the judge before Kincaid or Slade could stop them. Kincaid was not a fool. He anticipated their move. By the next morning, he had set up a checkpoint on the main road out of town, stopping every wagon, searching every rider. The primary artery of escape was severed. "We cannot go that way," Eli said, studying the blockade from a high ridge. "We will have to take the old canyon route." Gallows Cut. Sim, who had joined them, shook his head, his expression grim. "That place is bad medicine. Eli, the spring rains bring the rocks down. It is unstable." "It is our only way," Eli said, his voice final. The night before their departure was tense. They gathered in the relative safety of the church, the air thick with the smell of old wood and hymnals. Rosie was carefully packing the ledgers into a waterproof oilskin pouch. Sim was checking the shoes on the horses. Mara and Eli stood by the open door, looking out at the night. The sky flickered with distant, silent lightning. Eli turned to her. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a thin silver chain. At its end was a small, flat, silver locket, engraved with a simple wave pattern. It was not a piece of fine jewelry. It was practical, its surface scratched and worn. "This was my mother's, too," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble. He opened the locket. Inside, there was no portrait. Instead, there was a tiny, tightly folded piece of parchment. He carefully unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map, a series of lines and symbols that were meaningless to her. "When I was a scout, I learned to find water where no one else could. He explained, there are signs, the way certain plants grow, the lay of the land. There is an underground spring about 5 miles north of here. It never runs dry. This map shows how to find it. He pressed the chain into her hand. You should have this. If I get lost, if anything happens, you and Rosie will still have water. You will be able to survive. Mara stared at the locket in her palm. It was the most practical, the most real, the most profound declaration of love she could imagine. He was not giving her a promise of forever. He was giving her a promise of tomorrow. He was giving her a future, even if he was not in it. Her throat felt tight, and she could not speak. She simply closed her fingers around the locket, its cool metal a comforting weight against her skin. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the dim light from the church. She managed a small, shaky smile and reached up to pat the solid wall of his chest. Do not get lost, she said, her voice a little husky. A rare, genuine smile touched Eli's lips, crinkling the corners of his eyes. He covered her hand with his own. If I get lost, he said, his voice soft and full of a meaning that went far beyond the words. I will just have to find a reason to stay. Gallows Cut was a wound in the earth, a narrow passage carved by an ancient, forgotten river. The rock walls rose up on either side, steep and oppressive, the color of dried blood in the harsh afternoon light. The air was still and hot, charged with the electric hum of the approaching storm clouds that gathered on the horizon. Eli led the way, his horse picking its path carefully through the treacherous scree. Mara and Rosie followed, with Jonah and Sim bringing up the rear, leading a single pack mule that carried their most precious cargo, the ledgers, wrapped securely in oilskin. They moved in a tense silence, the only sounds the clatter of hooves on loose stone and the creak of saddle leather. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered warning. Eli's eyes were constantly moving, scanning the canyon rim above them, reading the terrain with the practiced gaze of a man who knew that a landscape like this was a natural trap. The first shot came without warning. It was not a loud bang, but a sharp, whip-crack sound that echoed and multiplied off the canyon walls, making it impossible to tell where it had come from. A split second later, a puff of rock dust exploded from the wall just inches from Mara's head. Sparks flew like angry fireflies. Chaos erupted. The horses screamed and reared, their eyes wide with terror. The pack mule, struck by a second bullet, let out a terrible, gurgling bray and its legs buckled. It fell heavily onto its side, sending the precious crate containing the ledgers tumbling down a steep, rocky embankment, where it burst open, scattering its contents like fallen leaves. Their proof, their only hope, lay exposed and vulnerable on the canyon floor. Figures appeared on the rim above them. Kincaid, Slade, and a half-dozen of their hired men silhouetted against the bruised purple sky. They had been waiting. Nowhere to run, Cutter Kincaid's voice boomed down, full of triumphant malice. Another shot rang out, aimed not at the men, but at the two women. Rosie cried out in fear. In a movement so fast it was almost a blur, Jonah threw himself from his horse. Shoving his sister behind a small outcrop of rock, he grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain, as the bullet tore through the fleshy part of his shoulder, spinning him around. He slumped against the rock wall, his face pale, his hand coming up to clutch the bleeding wound. The gunfire, echoing and reverberating in the narrow canyon, was a physical force. The vibrations loosened the unstable rocks above. A low rumbling sound began, a deep growl from the belly of the earth. It grew louder, a cascade of falling stone. It was not a major landslide, but a shower of rocks and debris that rained down on them. Eli shoved Mara toward the relative safety of an overhang, but he was not fast enough to save himself. A large, jagged slab of rock, dislodged from above, slid down and slammed into the ground, pinning his leg beneath its crushing weight. He cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of agony, his leg trapped and broken. Eli Mara screamed, scrambling toward him. He was pale, his face beaded with sweat, but his eyes were clear and focused. "The books, Mara," he gritted out through clenched teeth. "Get the books and go take Rosie and Jonah and run." For a heartbeat, she froze. The scout, the survivor, was telling her to save herself, to save the mission. But as she looked at him, trapped and helpless, another voice, deeper and more powerful, rose up inside her. It was the memory of Sim's words at the forge, the steady, rhythmic clang of his hammer. "A good nail keeps the wheel from coming off. We do not trade people." She would not leave him. She would not let this be the end of their road. "No," she said, her voice a low, fierce command. Her mind, accustomed to calculating sums and balancing accounts, now saw the world as a problem of physics. The rock was the debt. Her will was the capital. She needed leverage. She tore a long leather rein from her horse's bridle. She found a thick, sturdy length of timber, a casualty of a long dead tree, jamming one end of the timber into a crevice beneath the great rock. She remembered Sim's words. She needed a good nail, a fulcrum. She drove a smaller, pointed stake of wood into a crack in the ground with a heavy stone, creating a pivot point. She looped the rein around the far end of her makeshift lever and pulled. Her muscles screamed. The leather bit into her hands. The timber groaned under the immense strain. Nothing happened. Kincaid's men were starting to make their way down the treacherous slope. She pulled again, putting her entire body, her entire will, into the effort. The rock shifted, a mere inch, with a terrible, grinding sound. Eli, his face a mask of pain, was able to pull his mangled leg free. By the time Kincaid reached the canyon floor, his face flushed with victory. Mara was helping a half-conscious Eli to his feet, using a rifle as a crutch. Rosie was pressing a torn piece of her dress to Jonah's bleeding shoulder. They were wounded, cornered, and exhausted. But they were not broken. "It is over, Mistress Quinn," Kincaid said, swaggering toward them, his pistol held loosely in his hand. "Give me the books." Mara looked at him, her eyes blazing with a cold, pure fury. She held up the green railroad ledger, its cover caked in dust, and in the middle of the canyon, with gunfire echoing in the distance, she began to read. 2 cash paid. Sheriff Judd Kincaid. For security, $10, she recited, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the rising wind. 2 cash paid. 1 week later. Same purpose? $10. To cash paid. 1 week after that. "Shut up," Kincaid snarled, his face turning a dark, mottled red. $10, Mara continued, her voice rising. "And here, an entry in a different book. To the personal account of Mr. Judd Kincaid. Deposit, $40. And another, a week later." I said. "Shut your mouth." Kincaid took a step closer, raising his pistol. "I did what I had to do. This is a wild territory. I did what I had to do to keep order in this town." His bellowed confession was answered by a sudden, blinding flash of light, a bolt of dry lightning, born of the storm that had been threatening them all day, forked across the sky. It struck the top of the canyon rim with a sound like the sky itself tearing in two. The dry grass and scrub brush, parched by weeks of drought, ignited instantly. A wall of flame erupted, a roaring, hungry beast of fire that swept down the canyon side, throwing Kincaid's men into a panicked, screaming chaos. Their perfect trap had become a fiery hell. In the swirling smoke and confusion, Eli leaned heavily on Mara, his eyes narrowed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He saw it. Through the shimmering heat haze, further up the canyon, he could just make out the crude, earthen dam Slade had built. He raised the rifle, his arms shaking with the effort. The world swam in his vision. He had one shot. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The bullet flew true. It did not hit the dam itself, but the main wooden support beam for the sluice gate, There was a loud crack of splintering wood. The structure groaned, sagged, and then collapsed. Water, the lifeblood of the valley, burst forth. A muddy, churning torrent roared down the narrow canyon. A force of nature unleashed. It hit the wall of fire with a great, hissing roar, sending up a massive cloud of steam and smoke. The flood doused the flames, saved the forest, and created a chaotic, impenetrable screen between them and their attackers. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of mud, water, and panicked men. Up at the railroad camp, the workers, seeing their water supply and their very camp being washed away by the foreman's greed, finally revolted. They surrounded Slade, their faces hard with anger, and overpowered him. Kincaid, his victory turned to ashes, tried to flee. He scrambled through the mud and debris, back toward the smoldering ruins of the town. In his panic, he did not see the object half buried in the mud. It was the old, cracked church bell, dislodged by the fire and the flood. He tripped over it, his foot catching in its silent, broken mouth. A sharp, sickening crack echoed in the sudden quiet. The man who had twisted the law to his own ends had been broken by the very symbol of its flawed justice. The great plume of smoke from the fire had not gone unnoticed. The circuit judge, on his way to market day, had seen it from miles away and had ridden hard, fearing a range war. He arrived to find a scene of utter devastation. In the muddy, chaotic town square, the law finally took its proper course. Jonah, his arm bound in a sling, gave his testimony. Mara, her hands scraped raw, her face smudged with soot, presented the green ledger with its damning evidence. The judge, a stern, unflinching man of the law, delivered his verdict. Kincaid, his leg crudely splinted, was stripped of his badge and placed under guard. Slade was taken into custody to be held for the federal marshals. The fight was over. The immediate threat was gone. Mara stood in the center of the square, the silver locket warm against her skin. She looked past the mud and the chaos, to the place where the red lark had once stood. There was nothing left but a blackened foundation and a single, defiant stone chimney pointing a finger at the sky. She had won. She had brought a measure of justice back to Dust River. But she had lost her home. She looked down at her hand. It was trembling. The days that followed the fire and the flood were quiet, as if the land itself were holding its breath, taking stock of the devastation. The sky, washed clean by the storm, was a brilliant, unforgiving blue. Dust River was a ruin, a place of mud and ash. But it was not a tomb. A new spirit, fragile but persistent, began to stir in the silence. It started with the water. Mara, holding the silver locket in her hand, opened it and showed the small, intricate map to Simeon Pike, the blacksmith. His face grimed with soot, studied the map, then looked at the parched land around them, and then back at the small drawing. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion. The map was a promise, and Sim was a man who understood the value of a promise made tangible. He gathered a crew, not with orders, but with a quiet request. He spoke to the ranchers whose cattle were still gaunt with thirst, to the homesteaders whose fields were cracked and barren. He spoke to the railroad men who had been left without a foreman or a purpose. He showed them the map. He did not speak of justice or revenge. He spoke of water. They began to dig. Eli, his legs splinted and bound, could not lift a shovel, but he sat on a crate nearby, his pale eyes watching the work, offering quiet guidance based on the map and his own deep understanding of the land. He directed the placement of the digging, showing them where the ground was softest, where the water would be closest to the surface. Jonah, his arm in a sling, worked alongside the others, using his good arm to clear stones and debris, his movements stiff but determined. The work was slow and grueling. Men who had been suspicious of one another now worked side by side, their shared sweat and labor a silent communion. They built a winch and a frame, their hammers ringing out in the still air, a sound of creation in a place of destruction. For 3 days they dug, a testament to a collective, desperate hope. On the fourth day, the shovel of a young farmer came up wet. A cheer went up, a rough, hoarse sound from throats raw with dust. They worked faster then, their movements energized by the imminent victory. By noon, a pool of muddy, brown water lay at the bottom of the hole they had made. It was not much, but it was a beginning. Over the next few hours, as they lined the well with stone, the water continued to seep in, and slowly, miraculously, the mud began to settle, the water began to clear. Women and children gathered, their faces full of a quiet awe. A bucket was lowered, and it came up full of cool, clear water. It was passed around, each person taking a sip, the taste of it a blessing, a sacrament. The town had been given back its lifeblood. In the evenings, Eli and Jonah would sit together, apart from the others, the silence between them no longer a wall, but a space for healing. They were a study in contrasts, the older brother quiet and watchful, the younger one restless and chafing under his enforced idleness. One evening, Jonah finally broke the quiet. "I was wrong," he said, not looking at Eli, his gaze fixed on the darkening prairie. "About you, about all of it." Eli did not say, "I told you so." He did not say anything at all. He just nodded, a small acknowledgement that cost him nothing and gave his brother everything. "That wallet," Jonah continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I cannot keep it. It is yours." "No," Eli said, his voice soft but firm. "It was Ma's. It belongs to her sons." The words were simple, but they were a bridge across the years of anger and misunderstanding. Jonah looked at his brother, at the deep lines of exhaustion and pain around his eyes, at the scar that seemed to have faded into the texture of his face, and for the first time in years, he saw not the man who had left, but the brother who had come back. A small, awkward smile touched his lips. Eli returned it, a mirror image of clumsy, masculine affection. No more needed to be said. The reconciliation was complete. Mara, meanwhile, had found a new purpose in the ashes of the old. She salvaged what she could from the fire, a few scorched bricks, a blackened iron pot, and, miraculously, the heavy iron cash box. Its contents singed but intact. She sat at a makeshift table in the church. A new ledger opened before her. The water fund was closed. In its place, she had written, "The Red Lark Reconstruction Fund." She began it with her own contribution, the small amount of money she had saved from the fire. Then Sim came, placing a heavy handful of coins on the table. "Put me down," he said, his voice a low rumble. Then came the others, the ranchers' wives, the farmers, the quiet men who had stood by in fear. Now came forward in hope. They brought what they could, $1, a few cents, a promise of a day's labor. Mara wrote down every name, every contribution, in her neat, clear script. The ledger open for all to see. The line of people waiting to sign their names was a testament to the change that had taken place. They were no longer just a collection of individuals. They were a community, keeping its own accounts. A few days later, the circuit judge, before leaving town, sought Mara out. He was a man who believed in the letter of the law, but he also recognized its spirit when he saw it. He looked at Rosie, who was meticulously cleaning and organizing a small stock of medical supplies donated by a passing doctor. "Your sister is a remarkable young woman," the judge said to Mara. "She has a keen mind and a steady hand. I have some connections at a training hospital in Cheyenne. They are always looking for promising candidates for their nursing program. I would be happy to write a letter of recommendation. They have scholarships for deserving students." The words hit Mara with the force of a physical blow. It was everything she had ever wanted for Rosie, the dream that had fueled her through the darkest days. It was the reason for every penny counted, every battle fought. And now it was here, a gift from the very system she had been forced to fight. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of a profound, bittersweet sorrow. Her little sister was going to leave. She was going to fly. Mara pulled Rosie into a fierce hug. her tears dampening the girl's hair. "Did you hear that she whispered?" Her voice choked with emotion. "You are going to be a nurse." Rosie's own eyes were shining, her face a perfect portrait of disbelief and dawning joy. Mara smiled through her tears, her heart both breaking and soaring at the same time. In the center of the town square, where the charred remains of the public notice board had been cleared away, Sim and Eli supervised the raising of a new monument. It was not a grand statue, but a simple, stark reminder. They hung the largest surviving fragment of the old church bell from a sturdy wooden frame. The crack in its side was a jagged, ugly scar, a permanent record of the day justice had rung with a broken voice. It hung there, silent, a warning that the law was a fragile thing, and that it needed to be constantly watched, to be kept straight and true by the people it served. That evening, the air was cool and sweet with the smell of new-cut lumber. The sounds of hammers still echoed from the foundation of the new Red Lark, but they were softer now, a gentle, rhythmic pulse of a town coming back to life. Children's laughter, a sound that had been absent for weeks, now drifted on the evening breeze, along the main road. A homesteader's wife was planting small yucca seeds, a defiant act of faith in a future where even the most resilient things could find a place to bloom. Mara and Eli sat on the newly laid wooden steps of what would once again be her home. The silence between them was deep and comfortable, a quiet space filled with all the things they now understood without needing to say. Mara reached out and gently traced the line of the scar on his face, her touch as soft as a moth's wing. "You are here," she said, her voice a soft murmur. It was not a question. It was a statement of a miraculous, unbelievable fact. He turned to look at her, his pale eyes catching the last golden light of the setting sun. He covered her hand with his own, his grip warm and sure. "Because you gave me a reason," he replied. Their quiet moment was interrupted by a familiar, gravelly voice. Aunt Hester stood in the half-framed doorway, her hands on her hips, her face a mask of loving exasperation. "Well," she said, her voice carrying across the sawdust-covered ground, "are you two just going to sit there and stare at each other until the first snow falls? There are beams that need hauling." The grand reopening of the Red Lark happened not with a bang, but with the quiet, satisfying click of a newly hung door swinging open. The building that rose from the ashes was both the same and entirely different. It was built with the timber of community resolve and mortared with shared hope. The long, scarred bar was back, polished to a warm glow. But the space itself felt larger, more breathable. The spirit of the place had changed. It was more than just a saloon now. It was the town's living room. In one corner, where a rickety table had once hosted loud, drunken card games, there were now 2 sturdy shelves filled with donated books and a comfortable bench where the town's children could be seen tracing the words in a storybook with their fingers. Near the entrance, a wide plank of pine had been nailed to the wall, serving as a public notice board. One side held offers of work, requests for help with a barn raising, and notices of goods for trade. The other side held a simple, empty wooden box with a slot in the top. A neatly painted sign above it read, "Public Opinion." The ledger, the symbol of Mara's private battle, had become a public institution. The new Red Lark was no longer just keeping the town's tabs. It was taking its pulse. Eli, his limp now a barely noticeable consequence of a leg that had healed strong but not perfectly, spent his days helping Sim at the forge. He was a natural with the work, his movements economical and sure, the rhythmic clang of his hammer adding a new, steady heartbeat to the town. One afternoon, when the forge was quiet, he approached the blacksmith with a small, heavy piece of silver he had acquired from a traveling trader. He did not have to say much. He laid the silver on the anvil and looked at Sim, his meaning clear in his steady gaze. "I was hoping you could make something for me," Eli said. "Something small, a ring." Sim picked up the piece of silver, weighing it in his massive palm. He looked at Eli, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. "I think I can manage that," he said. Anything special you want on it? Eli hesitated, then pulled the silver locket from under his shirt. He opened it, not to the map, but to the simple wave pattern engraved on the outside. This, he said, tracing the design with his finger, like the water returning. Sim nodded, his eyes full of a deep understanding. He stoked the fire in the forge, the embers glowing a fierce, creative orange, the work of making a weapon and the work of making a promise, Eli thought. Both began in the same fire. The day Rosie was set to leave for Cheyenne was bright and clear. The entire town, it seemed, had turned out to see her off. She stood by the stagecoach, no longer a girl but a young woman on the cusp of her future, her eyes shining with a mixture of excitement and a new, adult sadness at what she was leaving behind. Mara fussed over her, straightening her collar, tucking a stray piece of hair behind her ear, her hands moving with a nervous energy that belied her calm expression. The whole time, Eli stood near the new public well, the heart of the resurrected town. People laughed and talked around him, drawing water, exchanging news. The life of the town flowed from this spot, a constant, life-giving current. As the driver began to load the last of the luggage, Mara hugged her sister one last time, a fierce, desperate embrace full of 1,000 unspoken words. When she finally let go, her eyes were wet. She turned, almost blindly, and her gaze fell on Eli. He was watching her, his expression one of quiet, unwavering support. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod toward the well. It was not a summons, but an invitation. She walked toward him, her steps slow and deliberate, the crowd parting for her with a quiet, respectful deference. She stopped before him, the sounds of the town a gentle murmur around them. The sun was warm on her face. She felt the solid ground beneath her feet. Eli did not kneel. He did not make a grand speech. Such things were not his way. He simply stood before her, a man who had found his place in the world not on a map, but in the geography of a woman's heart. He took a small, newly forged silver ring from his pocket. It was simple, unadorned, save for a delicate, continuous wave that was carved into its surface. He took her hand, his thumb gently stroking the calloused palm. His voice was low, meant for her alone. Yet in the open square it felt as public and as true as the sun in the sky. "You make this place worth staying in," he said, his pale blue eyes holding hers. "You make it a home. Give me a home, Mara, in your name." Mara looked from his earnest, open face to the simple silver ring. She saw her future in its unbroken circle, a future of quiet days and shared burdens, of love that was not a grand passion but a steady, reliable presence, a future of water in the well and truth in the books. She looked up at him, and her answer was a whisper, a vow spoken in the language they had created together. "We will keep the books for each other," she said. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. Her hand, which had felt so empty since the fire, now felt whole. Her fingers, which had grown strong from counting coins and holding on to hope, laced with her eyes, which had seen so much loss, were now as bright and clear as the new water. Just before the stagecoach pulled away, Jonah approached Eli, his arm now free from its sling. He held out the old, worn leather wallet. "I think you should have this back," he said, his voice quiet. Eli started to refuse, but Jonah pressed it into his hand. "No, really, look inside." Eli opened the wallet. The faded photograph of the three brothers was still there, but something was different. The corner of the photograph, which had been torn and dog-eared for as long as he could remember, had been carefully, almost lovingly, repaired with a small piece of glued paper. He looked at Jonah, his eyebrows raised in a silent question. "I found it in Kincaid's personal effects when they were clearing out his office," Jonah explained, a look of wonder on his face. "He must have found the picture somewhere, all those years ago, and he fixed it. He just kept it." The revelation settled between them, a small, quiet truth that did not change the past, but shaded it with an unexpected complexity. A man's life was more complicated than a simple accounting of good and evil. Even in a heart as hard as Kincaid's, there had been a small, protected corner for a memory of 3 boys squinting into the sun. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the square and painting the sky in strokes of soft gold, the sounds of the town began to soften. The sharp clang of hammers gave way to the gentle clinking of glasses from inside the new red lark, the distant, rhythmic tap of Sim's hammer from his forge, and the warm, inviting smell of cornbread baking in a dozen ovens. The town was healing. Overhead, hanging straight and true in its new frame, the cracked bell swayed gently in the evening breeze. It made no sound, but its silent, steady motion was a message in itself. A reminder that sometimes the most important part of justice was not shouting, but listening. That a community, like a person, had to listen to its own broken places in order to heal. Eli came to stand beside Mara on the steps of their new home. The golden dust of twilight settled around them, a gentle benediction. He put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. He leaned in, his voice a soft, gentle murmur against her hair, a hint of his old, wry humor returning. "I will still be here tomorrow." Mara leaned into his strength, a slow, happy smile spreading across her face. She felt the silver ring on her finger, a cool, solid promise. "In that case," she replied, her voice full of a light and easy grace, "do not make me give you any more reasons." Thank you for being part of our story tonight. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night. Like the video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so more people can hear this tale.